Hello, I am a deaf Botswana. The reason for this video is because Botswana does not have any appropriately, competently skilled sign language interpreters. So when I am communicating to you in sign language, you cannot understand what I'm saying. However, this video allows me to communicate to you in sign language with a spoken voiceover for you to be able to understand us. Here, we have interviewed 4 deaf leaders, all from Botswana. They have something important that they would like to share with you.
I would like to talk about sign language. There are many regions of this country and each with its own dialect of sign language. This results in much disagreements and animosity within the deaf community from different areas. Many deaf people are proficient in their area's version of sign language, but they are unable to communicate with one another effectively, and so communication breakdown occurs. Due to the different signing dialects from the various areas of the country, it has been extremely difficult for the deaf community to communicate with one another when each area has its own version of sign language. We urgently plead for the support of government to help the deaf. We need to standardize our sign language in Botswana. We must bring representatives of the deaf communities from the different regions of the country together, where they can reach a consensus on sign language for all the deaf in Botswana.
For many years, deaf people have experienced many barriers in their lives. It is a basic and fundamental right for deaf people in Botswana to be able to access information and communicate with the police, hospital staff, employers, and our educators. Right now, each of these presents a barrier in that when deaf people go to the police with a problem, the police are unable to communicate with them. And the same occurs everywhere in offices and hospitals. The deaf cannot communicate with anyone and are always left behind and ignored. Where are the rights of the deaf who need to communicate with the hearing community in Botswana? I say to you that I am deaf and I stand for my rights. Deaf people have a right to be able to communicate with various service providers. When a deaf person goes to the hospital worker must attempt to communicate with the deaf by writing on paper or using gestures. The hospital staff must try to communicate with the deaf and respect their basic rights for access to communication. When a deaf person goes to the police, it is the responsibility of the police to try and communicate with the deaf person, either by writing or to bring in a certified sign language interpreter to facilitate with communication. It is unfair to dismiss the deaf person's needs and tell them to wait until later to be helped. What rights do the deaf have if their needs are not being met? It is because up to now, government has not met the needs of the deaf people. We need government agencies to meet with our deaf leaders to discuss what can be done to improve the lives of the deaf.
Education for deaf children in Botswana is extremely lacking. Many of our deaf students do not do well because our teachers for the deaf are often not skilled in sign language or know very little signs. As an example of the good enough attitude of the teachers for the deaf, many of our hearing teachers will often teach children words in English and show them how to say these words in sign language, but they often not convey the meaning of such words. The result is that many deaf children remember these words and are unable to repeat these words in sign language, but they cannot form coherent sentences or to properly use these words correctly because they do not know what it means. The ages of 0 to 5 is a crucial age for language acquisitions in children, and even more so for deaf children. Deaf children who have acquired language early in their lives will grow to develop a proficient understanding of language and, through their proficient use of the language, become self-sufficient adults. However, deaf children who have not acquired a language in early life will never be able to master any language in life. This puts deaf children at a huge disadvantage when they're unable to communicate effectively and understand their world around them. I feel very concerned with our present situation where hearing educators and sign language interpreters in the deaf classrooms are teaching our deaf children with very poor to minimal signing skills. It is the responsibility of our special education coordinators to not only gauge the teaching skills of our teachers, but they must also assess the signing skills of our educators as well. This is a big problem for our deaf children. We desperately need to monitor our deaf education system. Many of our hearing educators believe that they are skilled in sign language when they actually are not. We urgently and desperately plead to the government to implement monitoring agencies to examine the capacity of our hearing educators and sign language interpreters in the classroom. In the schools, we have deaf aides working alongside the hearing educators. The deaf aides will often try to provide the hearing educators with the correct signs, but many of the hearing teachers do not accept that they are wrong and will often ignore the feedback of the deaf aides, continuing instead to present the lesson in their own made-up signs, which the deaf students are unable to understand. The deaf aides are often asked to sit in a corner of the classroom and watch over the students, but they are typically not welcome to participate in the active process of educating our deaf students. In our classrooms of deaf students, we must have deaf teachers who are proficient in sign language to educate our deaf children. Currently, our deaf children are being educated by hearing teachers with very poor signing skills, and our students are suffering. It is only the skilled and qualified teachers for deaf that our children will, through understanding their lesson, become inspired to grow and learn with renewed interest in their studies. The deaf adults in our community are motivated to become educators for our deaf children. We need the support of the government to help these deaf adults obtain the educational training they need to become competent and qualified teachers for the deaf. Only then can our deaf teachers properly teach and educate our deaf children, who will then have the capacity to excel.
There is a big problem with respect to the sign language of the deaf. Different dialects of sign language from all the various regions needs to be consolidated into one standardized language as a basic and fundamental human rights for the deaf. This needs to be done for the sake of our deaf children who need language in order to be able to grow and learn. The University of Botswana's special education program is not providing our educators of deaf children with appropriate signing skills. These educators must immerse themselves into the deaf community and interact with the deaf. Our language is a continually evolving one, and the educators of the deaf need to keep up with the changing and evolving trends of Botswana Sign Language by interacting with the deaf and immersing themselves into our culture if they wish to become proficient signers. Now is the time for change. Now is the time for us to develop the language I've used my whole life. Deaf people can no longer sit back and keep silent. Now is the time for us to develop our language. No longer will we be left behind. Now is the time for us to move forward and to develop our language as our fundamental right. It is time for a new beginning. Starting right now, we need to implement these changes to support the development of language in our deaf children. It's the time for change.